Okay, folks, buckle up, because tonight's story is about a book that never existed until people started believing in it. Get ready for a wild ride. In 1924, a horror writer mentioned a book in a story. He made it up, every detail, the author, the title, the history. He told everyone it was fake. He wrote letters explaining he invented the whole thing, and yet, within a decade, people were asking librarians for it. Bookstores were getting requests. Someone even slipped a card for it into the Yale University Library catalogue. Today, you can buy a copy of it on Amazon. Now, people have used its rituals. People have died with it on their nightstand. Now, how does a book that never existed become the most dangerous grimoire on Earth? Okay, so right away you're probably thinking, come on, a fake book that became real. That's like saying a fictional restaurant started serving actual food. But here's the thing. This is a story about how belief works. I mean the kind of belief that makes you drive to a library and ask for a book that a horror writer dreamed up. That takes some serious effort. That takes conviction. And that conviction is about to get very, very weird. The fiction. H.P. Lovecraft did not set out to create the world's most dangerous grimoire. He set out to write horror stories, and he needed props. In the early 1920s, Lovecraft was doing what horror writers had done for generations, giving his stories texture. A mysterious book that characters could reference, quote from, and fear. It was a literary device, nothing more. He called it the Necronomicon, a word he said that came to him in a dream. He translated it from the Greek as an image of the law of the dead. Scholars later pointed out that his etymology was almost entirely wrong. But that didn't matter. The name sounded ancient. It sounded forbidden. It sounded like something you shouldn't open after dark. Now, Lovecraft gave the book a complete fictional history. He said it was originally written in Arabic around 700 AD by a man named Abdul Alhazred, known as the Mad Arab. Alhazred, according to this invented timeline, worshipped entities called Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu, travelled the ruins of Babylon and the empty deserts of Arabia, and wrote the book in Damascus before dying in 738 AD. His death was dramatic. Lovecraft claimed he was seized by an invisible monster in broad daylight and devoured before witnesses. He said the book was then translated into Greek in 950, banned and burned in 1050, translated into Latin by a Danish scholar in 1228, and banned again by Pope Gregory IX in 1232. An Elizabethan translation by the magician John Dee supposedly existed in fragments only. Copies were held by 5 institutions worldwide, including the British Museum and Harvard. Now, every date, every translator, every papal ban, all completely invented. Lovecraft even wrote a document called History of the Necronomicon, just to keep his own fictional details consistent. Now, he told his friends it was fake. He told his readers it was fake. In the letter, he wrote plainly, there was never any Abdul Alhazred or Necronomicon. I invented these names myself. Now, this is where the story should have ended. A writer makes up a prop. The prop stays on the page. Everyone moves on. But that's not what happened at all, not even close. So, the man himself said it was fake multiple times in writing, and yet people still went looking for it. That's like the inventor of the telephone telling you it doesn't work, and you still pick up the receiver expecting a dial tone. But I'll give Lovecraft this much credit. He built the lie with incredible detail. Pope Gregory IX, real pope, 1232, correct year for that pope. Now, when you mix fiction with real historical anchors, something happens in the brain. It starts to feel possible, and possible is a very dangerous word. The believers. Now, something strange started happening while Lovecraft was still alive. People began asking if the Necronomicon was real. Readers wrote him letters. Where could they find a copy? Which library held one? Was the Arabic version or the Greek translation more accurate? Now, these were not all casual fans. Some were serious researchers, students of the occult, people who should have known the difference between a literary device and an actual book. Now, Lovecraft patiently explained again and again that he invented the whole thing. But the questions kept coming, and they escalated. A bookseller named Philip Duchesne published a hoax catalogue listing of the Necronomicon for sale. People tried to buy it. Someone, and to this day nobody knows who, sneaked a card catalogue entry for the Necronomicon into the Yale University library system. Now, students and researchers would look it up, find the card, and then discover the book was nowhere on the shelves, which, if you think about it, only made it more compelling. A book so dangerous that even Yale could not hold on to a copy. Now, other pranksters listed it in rare book catalogues. Librarians across the country reported regular inquiries. The fiction had escaped the page and was now circulating in the real world as rumour. And here's the crucial detail. Now, Lovecraft died in 1937. After his death, there was no one left to keep saying, "I made it up." The letters stopped, the denial stopped, but the questions didn't. The Necronomicon was now an orphan, a story without an author to vouch for its fictionality. The vacuum was all that was needed. When something sounds forbidden and nobody alive can definitively prove it doesn't exist, the human mind does the rest. It fills in the blanks, it builds the case, it starts to believe. A card catalogue entry at Yale. Well, think about that for a second. Someone was so committed to making this book real that they broke into one of the most prestigious libraries in the world just to plant a fake reference. That's not a prank, that's devotion. That's the kind of energy that builds religions. And I love the detail about the book not being on the shelf. I mean, of course it wasn't on the shelf. That's the best part, because now it's not just a book, it's a missing book. And a missing book is way more interesting than a book you can actually read. The Simon Edition. In 1977, a publisher called Lovecraft released a limited edition hardback. The title on the cover was The Necronomicon. The author was listed simply as Simon. Simon was almost certainly Peter Lavender, an American occultist and writer. Now, 2 other books registered under Simon's name were filed at the US Copyright Office, with Lavender listed as the author and Simon listed as his pseudonym. Now, Lavender has denied this for decades, but the paper trail speaks for itself. The Simon Necronomicon told an extraordinary origin story. Simon claimed that a mysterious monk had introduced him and his associates to a Greek translation of the Necronomicon. After experimenting with the text, they concluded it was a genuine collection of magical rituals predating most known religions. Now, Simon warned readers that anyone attempting to use the book might unleash dangerous forces. Now, the book contained actual rituals, incantations, seals, conjurations. Some were intended to ward off evil. Others invoked entities with names drawn from Sumerian and Babylonian mythology: Marduk, Tiamat, Cthulhu, which sounds suspiciously like Cthulhu. And the book even included instructions for human sacrifice to enchant a ceremonial knife. In 1980, Avon Books released the paperback. It was advertised in Omni magazine, a publication dedicated to science and technology. A grimoire marketed alongside articles about space exploration and artificial intelligence. And it sold not just a few copies. The Simon Necronomicon had been in print since the 1980s and has sold over 1 million copies. Let's pause on that. A book based on a fictional prop from horror stories, stitched together from Sumerian mythology and Lovecraftian references, sold over 1 million copies to people who may or may not have understood its origins. Owen Davis, a historian of magic books, called it a well-constructed hoax. But then he added something really interesting. Making a grimoire by stitching together material from previous sources, he said, is a well-worn motif in grimoire history. So, in other words, the Simon Necronomicon was made the same way the real grimoires were made, which raises a question most people are not comfortable asking. A mysterious monk, a Greek manuscript, a publisher called Lovecraft, which literally translates to snake power. Look, I'm sorry, but if your publisher is named after snake power and your author is using a fake name, maybe we should have asked a few more questions before buying the book. But here's what gets me. Over 1 million copies sold. That's not a cult following, that's mainstream. Your aunt probably has a copy next to a yoga mat. And the historian saying it was made the same way as real grimoires. That's the kind of detail that makes you sit down slowly. The Crowley Connection. Well, now we enter territory where things get genuinely strange. Kenneth Grant was a British occultist who led his own branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, an organisation originally associated with Aleister Crowley. Now, Grant was not a fringe figure in the occult world, he was a major voice, and he believed sincerely and completely that there was a connection between Crowley's magical system and Lovecraft's fiction. Now, Grant pointed to specific correspondences. Crowley's system spoke of contacting entities from other dimensions. Lovecraft's fiction described entities from other dimensions. Crowley used ritual to open gates. Lovecraft wrote about Yog-Sothoth as the gate and the key to the gate. The parallels, if you were inclined to see them, were striking. Now, Grant went further. He suggested that Crowley had somehow accessed the same cosmic forces that Lovecraft described, but through ritual experience rather than literary imagination. In Grant's view, Lovecraft had tapped into genuine esoteric knowledge through his unconscious mind. The Necronomicon in this reading was not fiction, it was a transmission, a signal received by a writer who didn't understand what he was receiving. That is, to put it mildly, a significant claim. It requires you to believe that a man who explicitly said he invented the Necronomicon was actually channeling real occult knowledge without knowing it. It also requires you to believe that fiction can accidentally be true. But Grant was not alone. Other occultists began treating the Necronomicon as a working magical system, not as literature, not as curiosity, but as a tool. Chaos magicians in particular, who believe that belief itself is the operative force in magic, found the Necronomicon perfectly suited to their practice. Because in chaos magic, it doesn't matter whether the entity you are summoning is real in an objective sense. What matters is whether you believe it is real long enough for the ritual to work. And if the results come, if something happens in that room, if you feel something or see something that you can't explain, then for all practical purposes, it's real. The fiction and the practice have now fused completely, and neither side was letting go. So let me get this straight. Lovecraft invents a book about cosmic horrors from other dimensions. Crowley's system is about contacting beings from other dimensions. And Kenneth Grant says, wait, what if they're both talking about the same thing? That's like saying a sci-fi writer and a radio operator are both receiving signals from the same alien planet, just using different antennas. One uses a ritual circle, the other uses a typewriter. Now, I'm not saying Grant is right, but I'm saying the coincidence is thick enough you could spread it on toast. And chaos magicians saying belief is a tool. That's the kind of idea that either sounds insane or revolutionary, depending on what time of night it is. The rituals that worked. Here is where the story crosses a line that most retellings refuse to acknowledge. People actually performed the rituals in the Simon Necronomicon, not as a joke, not as a creative writing exercise, as genuine magical operations, and some of them reported results. Now, you need to be careful here. I'm not telling you that the rituals in the Necronomicon can summon interdimensional entities, but I am telling you that people who performed those rituals believed they experienced something. And the distinction between those two statements is where this entire story lives. Online forums dedicated to occult practice are full of accounts from people who worked with the Simon Necronomicon. Some describe a sense of oppressive presence during rituals. Others report vivid dreams, strange synchronicities, or emotional states they could not explain. A few describe physical phenomena, cold spots, electrical interference, the feeling of being watched. Now, are these results real? Well, that depends entirely on what you mean by real. Now, if you mean, did a Babylonian deity physically manifest in the room? Well then, no, probably not. But if you mean, did the practitioner experience something they could not easily dismiss as imagination? Then the answer is yes, repeatedly, consistently, across different people, different countries, different decades. The occult community has a term for this, egregore. Now, an egregore is a collective thought form, an entity created by the focused belief of the group. The more people who believe in an entity and direct energy toward it through ritual and meditation, the more real it becomes within the experiences of those practitioners. Think of it this way. If one person sits in a dark room chanting Sumerian names, nothing happens. Now, if 10,000 people do it over a 40-year period, you've created something. Now, not physically, not in any way a scientist could measure, but in the shared experience of everyone who participated. The Necronomicon has been in print for over 40 years. It's sold over 1 million copies. Its rituals have been performed thousands of times. If egregores are real, then something has been built. Something that did not exist before Lovecraft invented it now exists because enough people believed it into being. And that is either the most fascinating thing about this story or the most terrifying. Well, I want to be really clear about something. People experiencing cold spots and weird dreams does not prove that Cthulhu is real. It proves that the human brain is phenomenally good at finding patterns, especially when you've just spent 2 hours chanting in a dark room covered in fake Sumerian symbols. But here's what bugs me. The reports are consistent. Different people, different countries, different decades, and they're describing the same kinds of experiences. That's either a very persistent coincidence or something else. And the egregore idea. If you're keeping score at home, that's basically saying that if enough people pretend something is real, it starts acting like it's real, which is either the dumbest thing I've ever heard or the most accurate description of human civilization ever written. The murders. In November 1996, in a small town of Eustis, Florida, a 16-year-old named Rod Ferrell led a group of teenagers who called themselves a vampire clan. They broke into the home of Richard and Ruth Wendorf. By the time they left, both parents were dead. Ferrell was not just a troubled teenager, he was a self-styled cult leader who claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire named Visago. He'd recruited followers from Kentucky and Florida. They drank each other's blood. They performed rituals. And at the center of their practice was a copy of the Simon Necronomicon. Now, during the trial, the Necronomicon was entered as courtroom evidence. The prosecution argued that the book had played a role in the group's activities. Ferrell had reportedly used it during cult rituals. The book's own introduction warns that its contents are potentially life-threatening, and that readers need perfect mental health, or the book is extremely dangerous. Now, Ferrell, by any measure, did not have perfect mental health. Now, I want to be very clear about something. The Simon Necronomicon did not kill anyone. A troubled teenager with a history of abuse and mental health issues killed 2 people. Books don't commit crimes, people do. But the Necronomicon's presence in that courtroom is significant because it marks a moment when a fictional book crossed from the realm of curiosity into the realm of consequences. A hoax book, based on a prop from horror fiction, was now sitting on the evidence table of a double murder trial. It had left the world of literature and entered the world of law. It had become, in the eyes of a courtroom, relevant to understanding why 2 people were dead. Now, you can dismiss this, you can say the book was incidental, and maybe it was. But ask yourself this: if the Necronomicon had never been published, would Rod Ferrell have found something else? Almost certainly, but that something else might not have come with rituals, invocations, and a framework for calling down entities from outside the known world. Well, this is the part of the story where everyone gets very serious and starts pointing fingers. So, let me point one too at the obvious. The book didn't kill anyone. A deeply troubled kid who needed help and didn't get it killed people. But here's the bit I can't shake. That book was on the evidence table. A court of law said, we need to look at this. We need to understand what role this played. And when your fake horror prop ends up in a murder trial, you've crossed a line that no blurb on the back cover could have prepared you for. And the book's own warning about needing perfect mental health, that's a kind of disclaimer that only makes sense in retrospect. And it's absolutely chilling in retrospect. The paradox. Let me take you back to something the historian Owen Davies said about the Simon Necronomicon. He called it a well-constructed hoax, but then he added it is their falsity that makes them genuine. What did he mean? Well, he meant that almost every famous grimoire in history was constructed the same way the Simon Necronomicon was, by stitching together older sources, by borrowing multiple traditions, by adding new material to ancient frameworks. The Key of Solomon, the 6 and 7 books of Moses, the Book of Abramelin, all compiled from earlier texts attributed to authors who may or may not have existed, and presented as ancient wisdom when they were actually medieval or early modern creations. The Lesser Key of Solomon, one of the most famous grimoires in Western occultism, is almost certainly a 17th century compilation disguised as a work of King Solomon. And nobody considers it less effective because of this. Occultists still use it, results are still reported. The same goes for the 6 and 7 books of Moses, which was a 19th century hoax that became a foundational text in several magical traditions, particularly in the American South and the Caribbean. So, here's the paradox. If you reject the Simon Necronomicon because it is a hoax, you must also reject the Western grimoire tradition. The methods are the same, the assembly is the same. The only difference is age. The Key of Solomon had 600 years to become legitimate. The Simon Necronomicon has only had 40. Dan Claw, a scholar of Lovecraft studies, put it this way: the hoax Necronomicons are every bit as authentic as the Lesser Key of Solomon or the 6 and 7 books of Moses, not because they contain genuine ancient wisdom, because authenticity in the grimoire tradition has never been about the original source. It's always been about whether people use it and whether it produces results. The Necronomicon is used. It produces results. By the standards of the grimoire tradition, it is as real as anything else on the shelf. Now, this is the part where my brain starts doing that thing where it folds in on itself like a pretzel. Look, if every grimoire is basically a patchwork of older sources and the Necronomicon is a patchwork of older sources, then the only difference between them is time and popularity. That can't be right, but it kind of is. The Key of Solomon was fake. The 6th and 7th books of Moses was fake. They're all fake, and they're all real at the same time. That's kind of profound, and I think I need to lie down. But think about it. If authenticity in magic has always been about use rather than origin, then the Necronomicon isn't an anomaly. It's just the latest entry in a very long tradition of making things up and then acting like they've always been true. The hidden question. Throughout this story, I've been circling a question without stating it directly. So now I'll state it. Can a book that was never real become real? Now, Lovecraft invented the Necronomicon as fiction. Readers believed it was fact. Publishers made it fact by printing actual copies. Occultists made it functional by using it as a magical system. Practitioners reported results. A courtroom recognized its influence on a real crime. And somewhere in that chain of events, the line between fiction and reality stopped mattering. This is not just a story about a book. This is a story about how reality works, or at least how human reality works. We tend to think of the world as fixed. Objects are real, stories are not. A stone is real, myth is not. But the Necronomicon suggests something more unsettling. It suggests that reality is partially constructed by belief, not in a vague philosophical sense, in a specific, measurable, historically documented sense. A fiction writer creates something from nothing. Enough people believe it that it becomes a physical object. That physical object becomes a ritual tool. The ritual tool produces experiences. The experiences reinforce the belief, and the loop closes. The Necronomicon is not real. It was never real. Lovecraft made it up. Simon stitched it together. Lavender probably wrote it. Every scholarly source confirms this, and yet, over 1 million copies sold, thousands of rituals performed, court evidence in a murder trial, a magical system with reported results that has been in continuous use for nearly half a century. At what point does something that was not real become real enough? At what point does a hoax graduate into a grimoire? At what point does a story become a door? Now, Lovecraft opened a door he thought was made of paper. Now, people have been walking through that door ever since, and some of them, if the accounts are to be believed, have found something on the other side. Now, whether that something is a product of their own minds or something older and stranger is a question I can't answer. But I can tell you this, the Necronomicon is still in use, it is still in print, and the belief that sustains it is not shrinking, it is only growing. And that's the whole thing. A man writes a fake book. People believe it's real. Someone prints a real version. People use it. Some of them swear it works. Now, one of them ends up in a courtroom. And somewhere in all of that, the question of whether the book was ever real stops making sense. Because real stopped being about origin and started being about effect. I don't know about you, but that kind of keeps me up at night. And not because of the entities, because of us. We did this, all of it. We built the door and then we walked through. And the strangest part? We are still walking. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy this one. And I've just started a second channel, Chronicles of the Drift. So please stop by and check it out. Link in the description below. And if you'd like to support the channel further, I've got Patreon and YouTube memberships. Again, links in the description below. Also, don't forget to check out the Mysteria Archive podcast, available on the YouTube Music app, which is free for podcasts. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Okay, my friends, be safe, and until next time, stay curious.